Hello, and welcome to History 300, the origins of the First World War. Lecture 24, Conclusion. If you do a search in the Library of Congress book catalogue for World War 1939 to 1945 causes, you'll find 897 entries. But if you change the search to World War 1914 to 18 causes, there are 1,657 entries, almost twice as many in other words. Now, to be sure, the First World War began 25 years before the Second World War, so it's had an additional quarter century to accrue records at the Library of Congress. But even so, the difference is in some ways surprising. Overall, the second of the two world wars looms much larger in the global consciousness today than the first, especially in the English-speaking world. One only has to inspect the history section of any bookstore to see that. Why has the origin story of the First World War specifically seemed more interesting to writers and readers than that of the Second? The main reason, I would suggest, is simply that the origin of the First World War is far more mysterious than that of the Second. Take the speed at which the war broke out, for instance. The outbreak of the Second World War in Europe in September 1939 took really no one by surprise. It had been obvious for months, perhaps even years, that war was coming. When it finally occurred, to many people in Britain and France it was greeted almost with a sense of relief. After years of increasingly gloomy and apocalyptic predictions about the coming war, the actual reality was a good deal less terrible than they had supposed it would be, at first anyway. In the Pacific, too, war was far from unexpected. While admittedly the attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941 took most ordinary Americans by surprise, the US government had long expected some sort of offensive action by Japan after years of increasing tension between the two countries, and it was only the exact timing and location of the attack which caught Roosevelt's military forces unprepared. By contrast, the First World War caught virtually everybody by surprise. On June 28, 1914, there was absolutely no reason to think that a grand European conflict was imminent. Relations between many of the great powers were, in fact, better than they had been for some time. The peaceful resolution of the Balkan Wars the previous year appeared to suggest that the continent's old diplomatic crisis management machinery was working just fine. Even after Franz Ferdinand's assassination, there was no immediate panic. People up to and including the Emperor of Germany himself continued to go on their summer holidays. Not until the Austrian ultimatum to Serbia on July the 23rd was there any real sense of foreboding. And even then, the British continued to believe that they would be able to remain out of the European drama right until the beginning of August. There is much more of a puzzle to the outbreak of war in 1914 then, than to 1939 or 1941. There was no slowly gathering storm, as Winston Churchill described the years leading up to the Second World War, but rather a sudden thunderbolt out of an apparently clear blue sky. Also, the moral narrative of the outbreak of the First World War is a good deal less straightforward than that of the Second. This is not to say that the cause of the Second World War is completely cut and dried. Historians continue to debate the roles of key participants like Adolf Hitler, Neville Chamberlain, Edouard Daladier, Joseph Stalin, Benito Mussolini, Hideki Tojo, Roosevelt, and so on. But there is little basic disagreement about who was to blame for the war. The central guilt of the fascist and militaristic powers of Germany, Japan, and Italy is felt by the vast majority of people to be uncontestable. The only real questions are whether they could have been stopped before they were able to unleash their wars of aggression, and if so, why were they not stopped? The world of 1914 looks much less morally black and white than that of 1939. Certainly, there were ideological differences between the different great powers that were recognised even at the time. Liberal parliamentary Great Britain was a great deal different from autocratic Tsarist Russia. But the differences were really less important than the similarities. All of the great powers, including Russia, had some kind of parliamentary assembly in 1914. All of them, with the exception of France, were monarchies. All of them were imperial powers, whether their imperialism was conducted outside of Europe or within it. The differences between them were much more about strategic self-interest than ideological disagreement. If ideology had driven the outbreak of war, then it would have been far more likely for Germany and Austria to be on the side of Russia than fighting against her. Indeed, Franz Ferdinand had hoped that this three-power League of Emperors might be constructed once he became the ruler of the Habsburgs. So although the Entente powers after World War I tried to construct Kaiser Wilhelm as a hate figure on the lines of Hitler, the comparison is both unfair and misleading. Wilhelm was certainly a foolish and intemperate leader of his country at times, but he possessed none of the malign single-mindedness of a man like Hitler. The outbreak of war in 1914 cannot simply be reduced to the ambitions of one ruthless statesman, as, to some degree anyway, the outbreak of war in 1939 can. So what did cause the First World War? In this course, we've examined the story of the July crisis itself, as well as the contextual background in which it took place. There is not going to be any official History 300 conclusion as to who or what was to blame. That's a question whose answer is ultimately up to you, gentle listener. I will, however, end by saying something briefly about the three big kinds of explanation that have been offered for the war. The first is what you might call the inexorable glacier explanation. This is the idea that the War of 1914 was the inevitable result of profound structural forces that had been steadily pushing away at the foundations of the European order until the whole edifice suddenly and catastrophically collapsed. These forces have been described earlier in the course: the interlocking alliance systems, the naval and land arms races, the militant nationalisms of the European peoples, the militarism and glorification of war that was so prevalent in 1914, the imperial rivalries that existed both inside and outside Europe. If such deep causes were ultimately to blame for the war, then the stability and peace that seemed to exist across the continent in early summer 1914 was simply a facade, a superficial calm disguising the terrible forces that were at work just beneath the surface. This theory also suggests that the July crisis in and of itself was of no real significance and deserves no particular close scrutiny. Something was going to set the whole disaster into motion, and that something just happened in the end to be the death of an archduke, but it could quite easily have been something else. The participants in the crisis in 1914 were simply playing the roles that history had assigned to them, though they little realised it at the time. Human agency, in the end, played little part in what occurred. One of the attractions of this theory has always been that great and profound events ought to have great and profound causes. Everyone agreed from its very beginning that the First World War was an event that was going to have vast repercussions for human history. It seemed almost undignified then to suggest that it might have occurred as the result of mere chance or the actions of a handful of foolish or wicked people. The problem with the inexorable glacier theory, though, has always been to explain why the war broke out when exactly it did. Why not in 1913, or in 1912, or 1911, or in many other years before, when all the structural conditions were pretty much the same? What was different about the July crisis from all the other crises that had come before and which Europeans had successfully managed? Is it really possible, in the end, to remove human agency from the story so completely? Individuals may have had their decisions shaped by the circumstances they found themselves in, but surely they still have and had choices, and those choices can have consequences. A second theory of the war's outbreak is what you might call the big old accident theory. Proponents of this theory all argue that the war was not inevitable, and indeed no one really wanted it, but that it broke out in the summer of 1914 through a series of spectacularly poor decisions, all of which helped to reinforce one another, until a point was reached that a war no one was really interested in fighting was the only remaining possibility. This theory was popular amongst many of the former participants themselves after the war. As David Lloyd George, the British Chancellor of the Exchequer in 1914, put it in his memoirs, "The nation slithered over the brink into the boiling cauldron of war, without any trace of apprehension or dismay. Not one of them wanted war, certainly not on this scale." It was also very popular in the Cold War years, when it seemed like a particularly apt, if disturbing, historical analogy to describe the nuclear standoff between the two superpowers. The British historian A.J.P. Taylor was a big populariser of the accident theory in the 1960s and 1970s, largely perhaps because it suited his conception of history as being largely the product of unintended mistakes and follies. Now certainly one doesn't have to look very hard to find evidence of poor decision-making in 1914. Some of the choices that were made during the July crisis seem difficult to understand as anything other than incompetence or willful blindness to the realities of the situation. On the other hand, one possible problem with the accident theory is that by refusing to charge the participants with anything other than foolishness, it essentially lets them off the hook. Was everyone in 1914 equally trying to avoid war and merely unable to do so? Or did some statesmen and generals know exactly what they were doing? Were they really so muddle-headed, or actually very clear-headed? And that brings us to the final theory, conspiracy. In many ways, it's the simplest of the lot. The war broke out because one or more people who had the authority to make it happen wanted it to break out. The follow-up question is, of course, who were these people? For the whole of his life, Kaiser Wilhelm was convinced that the great malign puppeteer behind the outbreak of the war had been his own uncle, Britain's King Edward VII, a theory which was problematic for several reasons, not least of which was the fact that Edward had died 4 years before the conflict started. Wilhelm himself was often cited in the years after 1918 as the man who deliberately caused the war. But in recent years, a slightly more sympathetic, or at least less condemnatory picture of the Kaiser has emerged, and attention has focused instead on men who were a little lower down in the chain of German authority, particularly Chancellor Theobald von Bethmann-Hollweg and Chief of the General Staff Helmut von Moltke. Moltke, before 1914, seems to have entertained the idea that Germany had to fight a preemptive war against Russia as soon as possible, before its window of opportunity for possible victory closed forever. Did he use the July crisis as an opportunity to force this preemptive war once and for all? David Fromkin certainly thinks so. Was Bethmann-Hollweg complicit in this? Sean McMeekin, as we have seen, has proposed, by contrast, that it's the Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Satsanov, as well as other key men in St. Petersburg and Paris, who ought to receive more attention on this point, certainly more than they have in the past. The problem that all theorists of a conspiracy for war have is in finding the evidence to definitively convict their chosen villains. No completely satisfactory smoking gun has ever emerged from the archives. There are hints here and there, trails of evidence which, if arranged in a certain way, certainly suggest dark motives, but no black and white proof. Does the absence of such proof suggest that the conspiracists are wrong? Or merely that those who were responsible for war in 1914 were very good at covering their tracks afterwards? I'm going to leave the final word to Michael Nyberg, author of an excellent recent book on the crisis called Dance of the Furies, which is as good a way to conclude any discussion of the First World War as any I've ever come across. Just before the outbreak of the war, he writes, when it was still possible to debate and discuss the wisdom of fighting, a letter to the editor in a local newspaper warned of the consequences that might ensue from a continental war. All who participate in war, of course, intend to put the death and destruction on their enemies, the letter stated. But history shows that crushing punishment has often fallen on those who thought that they could impose it on others. War is not a game to be trifled with. But the leaders of Europe did trifle with it in 1914, with the most horrid consequences for both the winners and the losers, as well as for the innocent victims of war across the globe. As such, the First World War is a reminder to all of us that wars have tendency to take on lives of their own and to destroy even those who ostensibly win them. Goodbye, and thanks for listening.